Hello everyone. Today is the second swatching video for you all. So as usual, I will put a link below to the video where I go through this book where I'm keeping all of my travel palette swatches, and that has details of all of the items that are inside this notebook. One of which would be this, but I'm taking it out to do the swatches in here today. The palette that I'm going to be swatching today is one that I don't think you all have seen. This is from Etchr Lab, and it is a round palette made out of porcelain. So I'll go ahead and open it and show you. So it has this nice little padded bit here. This is my swatch sheet that came with the palette. You can see all the colors that you'll see here. And this is mostly Daniel Smith, but there's at least some Schmincke and maybe one or two other brands mixed in. And then so it comes with this little round palette here. And I'm going to flip it over so that I can get that out. And then it has another little soft fabric buffer here between the two pieces. And then sorry, that happens sometimes. Color comes out of the palette when it's dried out. And then it has this little mixing palette and then another little fabric thing in the bottom. So I'm going to leave that there. And I'm going to put these off to the side, the containers. I'll leave the swatch sheet there so I know what I'm swatching. And then I'm going to keep this little mixing palette out because I am going to use it when I swatch my little triad table here. So I will put a link to the first video in this series so that you can kind of get the basics of what's going on here. But essentially I am swatching all the colors in this palette, and then I'm doing a primary mixing palette here so that you can see what some of the possible mixes are that you can get out of this palette. So as I said in the last video, I am trying to pick some kind of not necessarily a typical red, blue, and yellows that you would see in a primary mixing palette. So this is just a flavor for what you can get out of this palette, and you can get so much more. If you wanted to see, well, and this is not even a true representation of every color, but if you wanted to see a lot of the colors that you could get out of a palette, you could do an entire swatch sheet of each color mixed with each other color. And I have done that for a lot of my watercolor palettes, not all of them. And I'll probably do a flip through of the notebook where I keep those. But even though you're seeing what every color mixed with every other color looks like, you're not seeing the true range of what each color mixed with every other color could actually give you, because that's like an infinite, almost infinite possibility of mixes. But for today, I'm just going to be swatching each of these colors in these little boxes here, and then mixing just a limited amount of the colors here. So let's go ahead and dive right in. And this little palette is really cute. I have not used it yet. The little palette wells are very small, and this is actually well, how should I put this? So this has fewer wells than their first model that they made, which had, I forget how many wells, but it was a lot more than this, and the wells were super tiny, so you would have just a little bit of each color. But it's kind of hard, for that one, it was hard to get in there with a brush, so I never actually got that particular palette, but when they offered one with fewer palette holes or palette wells, I decided to go ahead and get it because it is kind of cute, and it's nice to have porcelain, because porcelain is a really great mixing surface, so that's really nice for this, and it doesn't stain. Although I haven't had really much trouble with some of my handmade palettes and the whiteboard material that I've been using as a mixing surface. But porcelain is pretty much 100% not going to stain when you wash it out. So I'm actually going to put the little mixing palette off to the side because we're going to use those at the end, because now I just need this. So I put these in some sort of color order. I started with buff titanium and went counterclockwise here and then kind of went around there and here. So that's what I'm going to do in my swatches. So the reason why I did that is so that I could essentially find buff titanium, and from there I would know what I'm mixing. My buff titanium had a lot of the mix of the filler that's in it. God, I'm always forgetting what it's called, but I mean, it's a natural filler, but I don't think I shook my tube enough when I put this out. So that's the reason why it looks a little mottled and weird. It's because there's too much filler on the top. But anyway, let's go ahead and go with the swatching here. So here's my water, and I also have a paper towel here, which I'm going to use. I've already been using this a little bit, but it doesn't matter. It has enough space. And let's see, so that you can see this the best, I'm actually going to, let's rearrange this a little bit so that I can zoom in. So that should give you a sense there. And I'm going to, so these pages are both for this palette because of the number of colors here. So I am going to just show you the top part here. Move that over a little bit so you can see. And I'll try and move this around so you can see the colors when I'm swatching them. All right, so buff titanium is first. And oh, what I should do, as per normal, I should put a little bit of water in each of these colors so that when I go through, they are a little bit wet already. This process takes a little longer when you have more colors here, but I think it's worth it so that you don't have to spend too much time grabbing the color out of there. When I'm just painting, sometimes I won't wet the colors, and then, but you can usually tell when I'm at the beginning of my painting session, colors won't be as vibrant because I'm not getting as much pigment. So see, just that little bit of water, you can really tell up there in the corner of the screen that it really wetted that up and moistened it up. Okay, so this is buff titanium, and this is going to be, I would say, maybe semi-opaque. Because essentially this is an unbleached version of white. You know how you have whole wheat flour and white flour? It's kind of like your whole wheat flour. Okay. And I'm diluting each time for each of these little swatches. It's going to be harder to tell with the buff titanium, but you'll see more when we go to the other colors. Okay, so the next one is, this is actually a Schmincke color. This one is Cad Yellow Light from Schmincke. And this one should be slightly opaque as well. Maybe more than slightly. Maybe this one's semi-opaque as opposed to semi-transparent, but might even be qualified as true opaque. And with the cadmium colors, you're not going to get as much variation when you dilute. I think it's just because it's so incredibly pigmented, and the nature of the the nature of the pigment is such that it doesn't readily dilute very well. Okay, the next one is a Daniel Smith New Gamboge. And whenever I'm making palettes, the colors that I choose, there is some rationale usually to the colors I choose. I try to at least, unless I'm trying to play around and kind of get, you know, sort of a interesting, different palette, I will try to have a warm and a cool of each of the primaries, and then I will usually pick some earth tones, and then from there it's just, you know, colors that I use a lot or that I want to play with and have in my palette. Okay, this next one is also Daniel Smith. It's Rich Green Gold. This is not a color I use very often, but I put it in here so that I would be tempted to try it more. I think Rich Green Gold is probably really good for ocean colors, you know, sort of the seaweedy, funky green that you get in the ocean. And I think I am probably diluting my colors a little bit more than I want to in the bottom one, so I will pay attention to that as I go. Okay, and this next one is Sap Green, also by Daniel Smith. Sap green really is a lovely color. And sap green tends to be one that varies by brand too. Okay, so this next one is Daniel Smith again. It's Phthalo Green. Make sure, actually I'm going to move that over a little bit so you can see. And this seems really dark up here. Dab off a little so I'm not putting too much water in there. That is probably one of the biggest mistakes I make when I paint, is I use too much water and forget to dab off my brush. So like here, I'm just going to dab off the brush and do the next one, box, just with a dabbed off brush. Okay, so the next one is Manganese Blue Hue by Winsor Newton. And I'm really warming up, it's kind of ironic, warming up to the cooler blues, these lighter blues that are kind of cool tone. I'm really liking those lately. I took a class recently from the woman who owns the Art Toolkit shop that makes those little mini palettes. Oops, I'm probably toning that down too much. And we've been doing a lot of skies and clouds, and lighter colors like this have really been appealing to me for those purposes. Okay, so the next one is Phthalo Blue by Schmincke. Part of the reason why I don't always wet my watercolors before I start is a lot of the colors that are, or a lot of the brands that I use, like Daniel Smith or Schmincke, we re-wet. Re-wet is a hard word to say. They re-wet very easily, and sometimes if you add water to them, they will just be so pigmented when you first start out that it's just like almost too much pigment. This one, which is a very pigmented and strong color, staining color to begin with, can definitely go that way. Okay. This next color is French Ultramarine. So the difference, oh, this is the one that fell out, I think. The difference between French ultramarine and regular ultramarine is that one has pigment particles that are a little bit bigger than the other. I think that the French ultramarine is the one with bigger particles because it does granulate quite a bit. But they're the same pigment. It's just a matter of how finely it is ground. So Schmincke makes a ultramarine called Ultramarine Finest, which doesn't really granulate. And I think that's just because the pigment size is way, way smaller. And so it just kind of blends in. Okay, we're shifting to a different color here. This is Quinacridone Rose by Daniel Smith. And I think I've said this before, that swatching is really not an exact science. I mean, it's kind of how however you want to do it. And this is just how I chose to do it. Okay. So the next color is Deep Scarlet by Daniel Smith. And because I'm in Colorado, you will notice that by the time I get to the end again, to the end of this little spiral I'm going on in this palette, that most of my colors will already be dry, just because things dry really fast here. Okay. So you can see these, moving that up. Deep Scarlet is a really lovely color. I find that I don't necessarily gravitate towards reds as much in watercolor as I do other mediums like acrylic, for example. And I'm not really sure why that is or why it would matter that I would like reds in one medium rather than another. But I don't know. Okay, so then the next color is Burnt Sienna. Not quite sure why I put Burnt Sienna on this place in the palette, but I did. I don't really know why though. And every time I go into the water, I am at least brushing some of the water off on the side of the cup. And that got really dilute. Okay. The next one is Potter's Pink, which is in the next row down. So I'm going to move that over so you can see where I'm going. And Potter's Pink is a good color to wet in advance because it is not heavily pigmented normally, and sometimes it can be really hard to get off the palette. And when we get down to the diluted versions, although the first one I'm just going to do with what I have left on my brush, the next one's going to be really faint. Okay, the next color is Rose of Ultramarine. Perylene Violet is coming up after this one. That's interesting. I don't seem to be getting a really thick pigmented version here. I went in to get more pigment. And Rose of Ultramarine is a fairly new color to all of my palettes, or any of my palettes. Because it is a mix, it's a mix of ultramarine blue and I forget what other pigment. I thought, oh, well, I can just mix that. But when I tried to mix it, it just never really came out looking anything like that. Okay, so this next one is Perylene Violet by Schmincke. And the small brush that I'm using really could go either way as far as being precise. I use a smaller brush so that I can try to be a little bit more precise, but sometimes it makes me a little bit more rushed so that I can try and fill up the space. So when I do that, I tend to go outside the lines a little bit more with a smaller brush because I'm not as careful. Okay, so I'm going to move this up a little bit one more time because now we're going to the last row. And this one is Perylene Green, also by Schmincke. Yes, also by Schminke. Okay, so that's this one. And Perylene Green is a single pigment. Even though you would think it would be a mix of something blue and yellow, it is a single pigment, and it actually is close. Whenever companies show it in their range, it's always near the blacks, because I think it is actually a black pigment that just skews green, which is kind of cool, kind of neat. And you can get a lot of variation out of Perylene Green. Okay. Next one is Neutral Tint by Daniel Smith. Neutral tint usually varies a lot. I'm going to keep that there so you can still see which one I'm going into. Neutral tint is generally a color that varies a lot by brand. Daniel Smith's runs a little bit purplish, but just slightly. I think that Schminke's neutral tint runs a little more purple. And really what I like using neutral tint for is for darkening colors. It really works pretty well for that, and is somewhat neutral, as the name would imply. All right, the last one in this row before we get to the middle is Lunar Black. And Lunar Black seems to be a favorite of artists who don't normally use black in their palettes, just because it has such a really interesting nature. It's very granulating, and you can get some really good effects with that, either by adding it to another color or you just using it on its own. You'll probably see that still on here already. I think I'm adding a little bit more or too much water as I go down. Yeah, you can definitely see here there's some serious granulation happening. And it does that pretty much consistently on pretty much all papers I've tried it on. Okay, this last color is Daniel Smith's Indigo, and it's in the middle one here, because that's the biggest well, and indigo seems to be the color I use the most. I tend to mix it with blues to make blues a little darker. I mix it with greens to make greens a little more intense. Also, if I'm trying to demonstrate perspective with color, I will add indigo to make things darker, like especially with trees, for example. I use indigo a lot for trees, mixed with various greens. All right. Okay, and I'm gonna get that up just a little bit. Okay. So now we can move on to our little color wheel here. And unlike last time where I accidentally put the wrong yellow, I'm going to try and pay attention to which one I'm using this time. So I decided to use French Ultramarine by Daniel Smith. So I got a little hair on there. It's probably a doggy hair. Deep Scarlet, also from Daniel Smith, and New Gamboge, also from Daniel Smith. So Deep Scarlet's a little darker than a typical red I would use, and New Gamboge is a little darker than the typical yellow I would use. So let's see how that goes and what colors we can get from it. So I am going to do the red first. I tend to go with the red first just because it's on the top and go that way. So Deep Scarlet, let me make sure I can find that on my palette. Let's see. Okay, it's this one. And because that water's been sitting on that color, I got a lot of pigment there. And what I'm going to do, actually, because I have several wells here that I can take advantage of, I'm going to put that red, excess red that I have on my brush in here. Yeah, just a little bit more. rinse out my brush. And now I'm going to go with the yellow, which is New Gamboge, which is this one here. Again, we're getting a lot of pigment because that water's been sitting there. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and put what I think is roughly the same amount that's in here and mix those in the palette here. Okay, so that's going to be our in-between color here. It's going to be a little bit harder in the well here, but I think I can still do it. I am going to mix a little bit more of the yellow over here on the side and put that there. And then I'm going to mix a little bit more. Let me make sure I have the right red. That's this one here. And mix it there. And again, there's not a lot of variation up here on the reds. Sorry, I'm going outside the lines a lot there. And I'm going to leave that there and potentially mix blue into that at the end. We may have to tweak it a bit again, like I did the last one. Okay, so now I'm going with the blue. And which blue did I say I was using? French Ultramarine. So let's go around to make sure I'm using the right one. Okay, French Ultramarine is the one right before red starts. So let's go here. Need a little bit more water. Because that one has dried. Because of my dry climate here in Colorado. Okay, so there's the blue. I'm just going to add a little bit more here to the well. And then I'm going to mix that half and half with yellow. Make sure I'm using the right yellow. Just that New Gamboge. Okay. I think that's pretty good. And because we're not using a really bright yellow here, we're getting sort of earthier greens there. Okay, now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to add a little bit of New Gamboge here to that green. Basically, it gives us sort of a muddy yellow. And then I'm going to add a little bit of blue to that. Sure I can, oh, you can still see that, okay. It's kind of hard because it's in the corner. Okay, adding a little bit of blue to that and putting that there. All right, now I'm actually going to clean out this well because I don't have a lot of pigment in there. And I don't just want to let it sit in there because I'm going to put that away after I'm done today. Okay, but I am going to use a different well just in case there's any residual paint in there. Now I'm going to put some more blue in there. And we're going to mix that with the red, which is what? Deep Scarlet. Let me make sure I can locate that again. Deep Scarlet is this one way over here. Oh boy, that was way too much scarlet. Okay, I'm going to add a little bit more blue because I don't think it's just because that scarlet is crazy color, which it is, but I think it's also because I didn't add enough blue. I think actually that's probably going to be where we're at for the equal amount. Because the red is stronger than the blue as far as the pigment. Okay, so now I'm going to add a little bit more red, so I probably should have done that in the, when I had too much red in there, I probably should just put it there, but this way we know we're mixing the right proportions here. And then I'm going to mix a little bit of blue in there. And that's going to be a lighter purple. All right, so again, I'm going to clean out that particular well. And then I'm going to go back to that first well that I kept and add blue to that. Let's see if we can just get a neutral right off the bat, because that's what we should get when we mix all three colors together. You know, I think first time might be the charm on that one, because that one is definitely a brown. Yep, that is what I would expect for mixing all the colors together, is this brown. Okay. So that's it for today. I'll give you a little preview of the next one that I'm going to be doing, which is on the next page here, or you might even get to see the next two depending on what's on here. Yeah. So it's the little handmade watercolor palette that I had that's with a little butterfly on it that I made from a vintage compact. And then also here there is a all core palette that just came directly from Core brand as little half pans. So we'll get to see that as well. But for today, that's it for that one. I'm going to pull out a little bit here. And then I'm going to put this palette back in the box. So one of these little things goes down in the bottom. I've cleaned out my mixing palette, so that goes in first. Then we put another little soft cloth in there. Then the color goes in there. Another little soft cloth, and then the swatch sheet for the case. But I'm not going to put that in there right now because those colors are still a little wet and I don't want to get pigment all over everything. But then I would put the cap back on there and that would be that. You can carry this around. It is a little bit hefty, I'll say that. And that's because of the porcelain, because porcelain is pretty heavy. But you saw how I used it. As far as travel palettes go, if you were looking for a first travel palette, this wouldn't necessarily be my recommendation for two reasons. One, the wells are just too small. So you're kind of limited as to which brush you can use with this, because you need to be able to use a smaller brush that can fit into these little wells. The other reason is the weight. There are a lot of travel palettes that are a lot lighter and a lot more convenient. You do get that added mixing area with the porcelain mixing palette that comes in here, which is nice, I have to say. But you could also, bring around a little palette like that. Or you could get that and then just use the mixing palette as you go, whatever you like. But Etchr, they also have some really great sketchbooks that are just for watercolor. So they have some good quality paper, and they just came out with a student line of watercolors too, I think. But I have not tried them because I'm not really into the student grade watercolors at this point, because once you go professional watercolor, it's hard to go back. And basically the distinction there is pigment load. You're going to get a lot more pigment and less filler in professional grade watercolors than you are in student grade. All right, so that's it for today. Feel free to like and or subscribe, and I'll see you next time. I might end up throwing in a few videos of different types before I do the next swatching video, but either way, stay tuned. All right, thanks so much. Have a great day. Bye.